Good morning, class 4 students. Today we are going to study a poem, The Last Bargain. Last Bargain. What is this bargain mean? What is bargain? Bargain is an agreement between two people. Let us see what is the real bargain in this poem. This poem is written by Rabindranath Tagore. As you know, he was a poet, essay writer, dramatist, and so on. In many fields, he proved his efficiency. Let us see the last bargain, the poem. Written by Rabindranath Tagore. Come on, hear me, come and hear me, I cried while in the morning I was walking on the stone paved road. Come and hear me, I cried while in the morning I was walking on the stone paved road. Here the poet says that in the morning itself, on a fine morning day, the poet was shouting aloud. Like you might have seen like street vendors for selling their things, for attracting the minds of the people, they used to shout aloud to sell their things. The same way, the poet cried or shouted aloud, come and hire me, I am ready for you, I am ready to serve for you, I am ready, come and hire me. Come and hire me, I cried while in the morning. I was walking on the stone paved road. Suddenly, when he shouted aloud, when the poet shouted aloud, come and hire me. What happened? Suddenly, sword in hand, the king came in his chariot with a sword in his hand. The king came in his chariot. What is his chariot? What is chariot? Chariot is a horse-drawn vehicle. Usually nowadays nobody is using such kind of vehicle. Earlier kings used a horse-drawn vehicle. So suddenly, sword in hand, the king came in his chariot. He held my hand and said, the king held the hand of the poet and said, I will hire you with my power. Of course, the king has power. With his power, the king promised him that he would hire the poet. The poet needed to do service. Poet needed some work. That is why poet shouted aloud, come and hire me in the morning itself. Suddenly the king came in his hand with a sword. King came there with sword in his hand and promised the poet that he would hire the poet. He held my hand and said, I will hire you with my power. But his power counted for naught. Not. It's an old English. It's an old English. Not. So, but his power counted for naught. And he went away in his chariot. The power of the king never attracted the poet. The king promised. The king came there with his sword and promised to the poet that he would hire, because he has power and he would be able to appoint him, he would be able to hire him because with the help of his power. But the poet was not impressed by the power of the king, because he thought that he would be a slave under a king. He won't have any kind of freedom. He would not be totally free. That's why he was not impressed by the promise of the king. He was not willing to accept the agreement of the king. So the king went away from there in his chariot and the poet walked away from there. But his power counted for naught and he went away in his chariot. Let us see the second stanza. In the heat of the midday, the houses stood with shut doors. So he was walking again. All through the day he was walking by shouting, come and hire me. So in the midday, the houses stood with shut doors. All the houses were closed. Doors were closed. Why? Because of the extreme heat. The poet tired because he was walking throughout the day. He was walking through the day and in extreme heat, and that's why wherever he looked, all the houses were closed, or all the house doors were shut. In the heat of the midday, the houses stood with shut doors. I wandered along the crooked lane. I wanted, again the poet wandered, moved, walked in the crooked lane. What is crooked lane? Crooked lane is this type of rods are called crooked lane. This type of zigzag rocks are called crooked lane. I wandered along the crooked lane. Suddenly an old man came out with his bag of gold. An old man came out with his bag of gold. He pondered and said, pondered means thought for a while. A person, firstly we have seen that when the poet cried aloud or shouted aloud, come and hire me, in the morning itself. A king came firstly with a sword in his hand and promised the poet that he would hire with his power. But the poet was not impressed. The poet was not impressed the power of the king. And that's why the poet was not willing to accept the agreement made by the king, or the promise given by the king. And again he walked from there. The king went away, and also the poet walked through the crooked lane, and he met an old man. An old man with his bag of gold. An old man came out with his bag of gold. And he pondered and said, thought for a while and said, I will hire you with my money. The old rich man told the poet that he would hire the poet with his money. He weighed his coins one by one. The rich man weighed his coins one by one in his hands. But I turned away. But the poet did not like that money also. So the poet did not like power. The poet did not like money or wealth also. The poet was not willing to accept the agreement of the old man with a bag of gold. And the poet walked away from there also, because the money or wealth also not impressed the poet. He thought that if he moved after the king, if he went after the king, he would be a slave. He would be like a slave. He won't have any kind of freedom. The same way, if he move after wealth or after a wealthy man, if he accept the promise of the rich man, there also he would not have any kind of freedom. That's why he was not willing to accept the demand of or the promise of a rich man. It was evening. Again the poet walked. It was evening. The garden hedge was all flower. The garden hedge. That means like boundary. Trees are planting or bushes are planting at the edge of a plot. At the edge. This just like trees or bushes at the edge can be called as actually a hedge. It was evening. The garden hedge was all a flower. Flower means flowering. The garden hedge, all these boundaries, all the bushes or all the plants were flowering in the evening. The fair maid came out and said, a maid, fair, beautiful lady who was looking after that garden. It was evening. The garden hedge was all a flower. The beautiful lady who was in charge of that garden came out and said, I will hire you with a smile. A beautiful lady, it was in the evening, he was shouting, the poet was shouting in the evening also, come and hire me. Suddenly, a beautiful lady came there who was looking after the garden, who was in charge of garden. That beautiful lady came out and said, I will hire you with a smile. Her smile paled and melted into tears, and she went back alone into the dark. Here the poet says that her happiness was sorrowful in disguise. That means she was also not satisfied, and moreover, he was not willing to go after beauty also. So power not attracted the poet. Wealth or money also not attracted the poet, and now the beauty also not attracted the poet, because the poet thought that beauty is not consistent, or beauty is not everlasting. Beauty of a person is not everlasting, and that's why poet was not willing to accept that the promise of the beautiful fair maid also. It was evening. The garden hedge was all aflower. The fair maid came out and said, I will hire you with a smile. Her smile paled and melted into tears and went back alone into the dark. She went back alone because the poet did not accept her promise or agreement, because the poet thought that the beauty is not everlasting. Beauty will lose tomorrow or after 1 year, after some, at any time, beauty of a person can be lost. It's not everlasting. That's why the poet was not willing to accept her promise or agreement too. And now let us see here. The sun glistened on the sand. In the extreme evening, we can say that, or in the evening, when he reached on the beach, the poet reached on the beach. The sun glistened on the sand. Glisten means shone on the sand. And the sea waves broke waywardly. Sea waves broke waywardly, not controlled. A child sat playing with shells on the beach. A child was playing with shells on the beach. He raised his head and seemed to know me and said, I hire you with nothing. Here in the evening also the poet shouted aloud and said, come and hire me. So by hearing the sound of the poet, the child raised his head and looked at the poet and said, I will hire you with nothing. Nothing is there with me. I can join, I can ask you to play with me. I have nothing, so I will give nothing to you, but I need you, I will hire you. He raised his head and seemed to know me and said, I hire you with nothing. From thenceforward, that bargain struck in child's play made me a free man. From then onwards, finally, the poet accepted the demand, accepted the promise of the child, because here the poet will get nothing from the child. Poet will be totally free. But poet accepted the poet would be able to play with the child, but he would not get anything from the child. The poet would be totally free with that child. He would be a total free man. Total freedom he would be able to enjoy. That's why finally he accepted the agreement of the child. This is called last bargain. So firstly, there was a bargain between the king and the poet. In that bargain, poet was not satisfied with the agreement or with the promise of the king. Secondly, we have seen that actually the poet made, there was a bargain between an old rich man with poet. In that agreement also, in that bargain also, poet was not satisfied. He was not willing to go after money or wealth. The poet was not willing to go after power. The poet was not willing to go after money or wealth, because all these are not everlasting. Power can be lost at any time. Money or wealth also can be lost at any time. And finally, you have seen a fair lady who was in charge of garden. She was also trying to attract the poet with a smile. But the poet believed that beauty is also not everlasting. So power, beauty and wealth, these are not everlasting. That's why the poet was not willing to move after all these three. Finally, he met a child and he promised nothing. So here the poet accepted that bargain and made an agreement with the child. This is called last bargain. The sun glistened on the sand and the sea waves broke waywardly. A child sat playing with shells. He raised his head and seemed to know me and said, I hire you with nothing. From thenceforward, that bargain struck in child's play made me a free man. This is called bargain, last bargain. All of you read this poem very nicely. All these lines are so beautiful, and Rabindranath Tagore is one of the beautiful poems. Thank you.